I'm your host, Laura Berry, and welcome to Out of the Box, an interview series about the abusive practice of solitary confinement. For the next 7 weeks, you will be hearing some very personal and heartfelt stories of survivors of solitary confinement, family members of those in solitary, and experts working to change the narrative of how solitary is used. These stories are all very personal to me. After being imprisoned as a child and personally spending 11,962 days in prison, some of which was spent in solitary while pregnant from a sexual assault by a correctional officer, I know the horror of solitary confinement all too well. I have no doubt that you will be moved by these stories as well. So, without further ado, let's get started. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, David. Can you take just a second and tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Well, first, Laura, thank you for having me. I'd like to acknowledge Decarcerate and all of their attempts and for making this possible. Very appreciative. My name's David Morgan. From Fort Worth, Texas. I served about 30 years in the Arkansas Department of Correction for first-degree murder. Was released February of 2018, and so it's been a little over two and a half years. Productive, and so pretty much starting a new life.
And so just to go a little bit further into that, so when you entered the Department of Corrections, you was a juvenile, is that correct?
Yeah, 17.
Okay. So I believe you and I talked, and you said you had served about a total of about 18 months in solitary confinement. Can you just give me a little brief description of things that you were feeling, things that you might have experienced during your solitary confinement?
Well, first time I entered solitary confinement was 1989. I had just, 18 years old at the time, and but I do remember that when I entered solitary confinement, the hole, as they called it back then, was that strip you down to your underwear. You have no other property. And I remember feeling just, the complete vulnerableness of it, and completely alone, shut out, ostracized, uh, and kind of invisible in some ways, like you're just thrown away and forgotten. Everyday life goes on without you, everything else as normal, but you're like in suspended, you just don't even exist, for a moment. And so, and also the thing that I remember feeling for me was almost the animalistic type. It made me feel like an animal uh, in a cage somewhere, that the only time you eat is whenever they put their hand through the bars and give you a tray. You drink, uh, you sleep, your bedclothes, your bed and stuff, they pull your mat, so you sleep on the concrete or steel. So anyway, it has that certain animalistic type feel to it and reduces you to your lowest state imaginable, So those are things that I remember initially.
Can you tell me, do you remember approximately how much time you were allowed out of your cell on a daily basis?
Well, if they had staff shortage, or there was some type of generally that's what they would justify it with, saying that they were short of staff, and so we wouldn't get rec time at all. But generally, if they had available staff, you would get 1 hour. That usually cut it into about 45 minutes. Outside you would cuff up. They put the cuffs on you, shackles or whatever. They would bring you out of your cell, and in some places they would have a day room. You would go in that day room for that remainder of time, or they would take you outside into a like an 8x10 cage. It was a cage chain link fence, just something that you would see a dog, or animals caged in. it was the same thing. And so, and then you would sit out there, you know, about 45 minutes to an hour, and they come get you and take you back.
So other than the officer sticking the tray through the bar and the cuffing to take you to and from that cage that they called recreation, or to cuff you and take you to your showers, what was it, 3 times a week you get a shower? Other than that, what kind of human contact did you have while in solitary confinement?
I mean, that was pretty much it. You know, the officers that you would have, some places, unless you were, it was a single man, then you would have a roommate, a cellmate. And so that would be, you know, there were times there that I was alone, but then there were times that I would have a cellmate. That could be good and bad. You know, if you have a cellmate that doesn't take care of his hygienes or the best that you can, because it's difficult in there. You don't have soap, you don't have any way to shower and stuff like that. So anyway, you can imagine being confined with another person that you don't even know in an 8x10 room, you know. So anyhow, outside of that, that's the only human contact that I would have, you know, that you have at that time, unless a nurse, you know, comes through for like pill call or something like that, you know. Outside of that, that's all the human contact you have.
So let's go a little bit farther. You said you served 30 years incarcerated. So during that 30 years, I would imagine that you came across a lot of people who went from population into isolation or solitary of some form and spent a period of time and then returned to population. What kind of effects did you notice that having on other individuals emotionally, mentally, anything that might have been notable a notable change from the person before and the person after?
Well, I remember there were guys that had went from population to ADSEG or to, you know, isolation, and some even for a couple of years. And but even whenever you went several long months extended, I had noticed that some of the guys would come out and they would seem kind of skittish, almost like it was hard for them to be around large groups of people. You know, in one of the last barracks that I lived in, there was 60, I think it was 63 men to that barracks. And so you don't have a lot of living space, you know, in that area. And so you're kind of tightly confined. But I did notice that it seemed like it was hard for them to get around others. Things would, you know, make them kind of jumpy. You know, if there was a sudden noise or a bang, you know, it like unnerved them. So it seemed like it was more difficult for them to interact and have a normal conversation, you know, with people. Things were broken up in spurts, and it just seemed like they would have a problem, you know, interacting or dealing or not being alone, you know.
Okay, so did you ever have an opportunity when you were in regular population to go into any form of isolated housing on a job or in any aspect where you noted other people that were behind those walls?
Yeah, there was there was quite a few times, pretty often, you know, I held a clerical position for a lot of, you know, my incarceration, and there would be times that we would go into the isolated, you know, restricted housing areas, and when you go in, you know, I would see a lot of different behavior and stuff. I mean, a lot of times, you know, I would work, you know, with security as a security clerk and stuff like that. And they might have a disruption where a guy would be back there, you know, throwing stuff, spreading feces, throwing it, just really acting all the way out of character, acting like an animal. And so they would have to take photos, course, they would take disciplinary action and stuff like that. But I would remember whenever I would go in there and the guys, whenever we'd open a cell, like if I was delivering law work, you know, how sometimes it seemed like they would order stuff that they might not necessarily need, but they just wanted that contact. And that I remember whenever I would go in, they would open the cell. It's a solid door, and inside that is the cell door. So I would walk up to the bars, and I remember first thing they would do, usually you sleep a lot when you're in those areas. And so when I would go in, the guys would be asleep. But the first thing they'd do is jump up and come running to the bars, you know, and be like, hey, man, you know, what's going on? So that was, you know, you can imagine how sometimes it's nice just to see, you know, either a friendly face or a face period, you know, of something other than what's restraining you or, you know, holding you. There was other times that I remember, in fact, it was at Bricky's, Arkansas. We went through a stage to where there was a very high rate of suicide. In fact, it was so bad that they actually did an internal investigation and came to Bricky's to try to find out what was going on. One of the things that was found was that guys, when they had disciplinary appeals, they would never hear anything back on a disciplinary appeal. When they did a routine check of like the warden's office and stuff like that, in the closet, they found stacks of disciplinary appeals that never went nowhere. They never left the unit. The guys never even received notification. They tried to get request slips or other forms like that they needed to get some type of help, mental health, you know, assistance and stuff like that. And they couldn't get no response. You know, everything was there. The grievances that they wrote, they had went to the grievance officer, their office, and found again just stacks of unresolved grievances and unanswered grievances that never went through the process as, you know, as it's supposed to. So anyway, what that did was that even more isolated the guys that were in there at the time. You know, if they had legitimate concerns or just needed, you know, things, needed legal supplies or needed whatever, they couldn't even get that. They couldn't get a response, you know. So it was like you're totally forgotten about and just left to fend completely for yourself with the limited resources that you would have in those type of areas. So what it did, it drove the suicide rate up. And, you know, and I did get to see firsthand a lot of those photos, take the photos, and it was very alarming, you know, very sad, you know, just to see the effect of it.
So, and having shared all that, is there anything that makes you share your story? What is the motivation behind sharing your story and wanting to see the end of abuse of solitary confinement in the state of Arkansas?
Well, I mean, the one thing is just that, you know, even though a person does something wrong, I mean, what punishment is necessary and what goes beyond a certain thing and that causes more harm than it does good. And so that would be one thing for me, having went through it myself and knowing firsthand how it feels. Some people are not able to deal with things like that. Some are. You know, I'm very fortunate that I was one that was able to go through those things and come out for whatever reasons it was, whether I had family support or friends or just whatever kept me connected, a lifeline. People that don't have that, it becomes, I can understand and can only imagine how much more difficult that would have been if you were completely, totally alone in the world. And so that's something for me that I would want to be able to get that out. And to also understand that whenever they have a large area that they can lock numerous people down, that they would use that also as a form of torture, as a form of bargaining, almost to where that they would try to provoke you. And I seen that also at the Bricky's unit again, that they had a large area, a max area that was all solitary confinement, ad seg, and that the officers there, a number of officers would actually try to provoke you to do something, to step over the line or to do this, say the wrong thing, and we're going to lock you up. And it's almost like having a boss that the first thing that they do whenever they're dealing with you is threaten you with firing you. You know, they hang that over. At some point, you know, them guys would come to where they say, okay, we'll do it. and then they would, and then the consequences come from there. And so it's just a misuse of the way they do it, and it does have torturous type methods to it, and it does, I've seen and I've experienced that it causes more harm than it does good.
So, in summarizing everything you said and just kind of bringing everything to a close, would you agree that the use of solitary confinement causes a sense of hopelessness, a sense of emotional detachment, and in a lot of cases, mental anguish that sometimes people don't come back from?
Absolutely, because I mean it's predicated. It's completely built on nothing but punishment. There is no rehabilitation of that whatsoever. It is merely for punishment's sake.
David, again, I want to say thank you. I know that sharing from one's experiences of such traumatic events is hard on a person, no matter how long it's been in their past. So I want to thank you for being willing to share, and we appreciate you stepping forward and wanting to help those who aren't in a position to help themselves right now.
Well, thank you, Laura, and thank Decarcerated again for having me and for doing this work. I think it's a good work.
I can't help but believe that after hearing the story today, you're motivated to join us. Here are just a few ways to get involved. Read our report about solitary confinement on Decarcerated's website. Follow us online. Over the next several weeks, we'll be posting lots of content about solitary confinement on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. Donate to the campaign. It's only through the financial contributions of supporters like you that we're able to continue this work. And finally, send us an email to join our monthly In Solitary meetings, where you can learn how to volunteer with us and help us strategize our work. Again, thank you.